Plato was born to aristocratic parents. His brothers fought in the Peloponnesian War between the Spartans and the Athenians, but he was too young. His uncles were Critias and Charmides, two of the 30 tyrants of Athens after the war. Plato was Socrates' student and engaged in poetry as a youth. He was in his late 20s at the time of Socrates' death, 399 BCE. At age 40, Plato left Athens for Italy, perhaps concerned about his own political future. Southern Italy had been the home of Pythagoras, and a century later there was a well-developed school of mathematics. Plato was friend of Dion, the brother-in-law of Dionysius I, the ruling monarch. There, in 388 BCE, he met Archytas at Tartetum. The two had common interests. While there are differing accounts of their relationship, it was clear that mathematics and philosophy were common interests. Archytas was a skilled mathematician and used mechanical devices to aid him in his proofs of geometry. This is where the two disagreed. Plato argued that the value of geometry resided in its ability to turn the soul from the sensible to the intelligible realm. Archytas was focused on the physical world, which Plato thought destroyed the value of geometry. Upon his return to Athens, Plato founded the Academy and turned his attention to the question of virtue. He claimed that what was considered real had an impact on how we act. Plato developed his theory of forms to describe reality. He claimed we had prior knowledge of all ideas before birth, for the soul, prior to being individuated at birth with the physical body, mingled with the forms. Forms were not definitions, as Socrates had thought, but recollections. They were real objects to be discovered through contemplation and recall. The forms, Plato claimed, existed in a transcendent world, apart from any individual mind. They are characterized as real, divine, eternal, unchanging, non-corporeal, rational objects of contemplation. Plato claimed the tangible world of experience constantly changed and was only an appearance, a copy of the more real forms. In observing the tangible world, one could gain only opinion, not true knowledge. The eternal, unchanging world of rational forms was more real than the appearance of the world, and could be grasped by the rational mind to give us knowledge. Plato accounted for both knowledge and change by claiming there were two separate worlds. The intelligible world consisted of the forms, which were grasped by pure reason. Mathematics and scientific concepts were apprehended by our understanding. Particular objects were appearances that we believed. Images, such as art, were only conjecture, twice removed from the true reality of their corresponding forms. Beauty as a form was grasped by the rational mind, just as the eyes see. The individual beautiful objects are inferior to the idea of beauty because they change and decay. Art is merely imitation and is furthest from the form of beauty. The highest sublimity of form was the good, because everything that had being is derived from the good. Plato has an allegory, the allegory of the cave, that explains how a person can become enlightened and apprehend the good. Through the discipline of reason, one is able to move away from ignorance, deception, and opinion. Understanding the good implied doing the good. Plato in this allegory recognized that those who have an understanding of the good have true knowledge and desire to support others in their quests for truth. Recalling the fate of Socrates, he claimed that a savior could expect rejection or even death. The means to truth was to allow reason to rule the soul. Plato claimed there were three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Analogous to the parts of the soul, Plato claimed were classes of people. Those governed by reason were philosophers, and Plato claimed they should rule the society, as their virtue was wisdom. Those governed by the spirit, he claimed, should be soldiers, because their virtue was courage. Workers were governed by their appetites, and when these appetites were moderately satisfied, the society was considered just, and the individual whose appetites and passions were moderately satisfied was healthy. When reason ruled the soul, there was happiness, health, justice, and freedom. Freedom was excellence. When philosophers ruled society, the society was just. Enlightenment requires the discipline of reason. Aristotle was Plato's student. The younger Aristotle disagreed with his teacher on the question of forms. If forms are the cause of things, how can they exist in a separate world? Aristotle thought that the distinction between form and matter can be drawn only in thought. Plato believed knowledge was achieved with the love of rational contemplation. To know was to be, and it was the love of beauty that afforded the apprehension of ultimate truth and goodness. Plato claimed all love seeks to possess what is beautiful and recreate it. The initial step begins with loving a beautiful person and having beautiful thoughts. Further, the realization that the beauty found in all things is one and perfect evolves an individual to loving the truths of moral practices and laws. In understanding absolute beauty, a person creates beauty and truth that is beyond mortality. This expression transforms civilizations into those that endure in truth and goodness. Aristotle claimed observation yielded knowledge because form and material were wed. To be was to be a particular thing. Aristotle's observations seek to answer what substance something is, and what did this substance have in common with other things. His mature philosophical thinking interlocks with the empirical sciences. He claimed there were three categories of science: productive sciences such as architecture and engineering, and practical sciences such as politics and ethics, and theoretical science, which sought information for its own sake. Aristotle claimed being was comprised of four causes: a material cause, an efficient cause, a formal cause, and a final cause. Matter, he claimed, is the principle of individuation. While there is difference, the difference is a being of some unique kind. While trees are universals, Aristotle claims these abstractions, like definitions, are one and the same as the individual thing. They do not exist separately. Aristotle saw motion as change, a movement from potential to actual, birth, growth, death, and decay. Efficient cause is concerned with why there is change. Everything that moves is moved by something else. Any form does not exist separately. The idea is not separate from the material. The formal cause, according to Aristotle, refers to what it is to be of something in motion. The final cause is the purpose for which something exists. Here is where theology and physics are wed. The universe is a collection of individual things that has potential and actual motion. No thing causes itself. Aristotle argued that while the universe had no beginning, efficient causation by itself resulted in an infinite regress of causes. The final cause, therefore, must be an eternal, motionless mover, one that lacks matter and potentiality, for it does not change. The prime mover, the unmoved mover, the final cause toward which everything moves. We profess that when God is a living being, eternal and most good, so that life and continuous eternal duration belong to God. The nature of the divine mind is thinking, and since the supreme mind would be degraded by thinking of things, the supreme mind thinks about itself. Pure activity of thought, which thinks about itself, thinks that perfection. Aristotle wrote every art and every scientific inquiry, and similarly every action and purpose, may be said to aim at some good. It appears then that happiness is something final and self-sufficient, being the end of all action. Aristotle's understanding of the soul is related to his studies of biology. The soul is the form of a natural organic body. The exercise of that actuality is the totality of the vital operations of the organism. The vegetative soul has powers of growth, nutrition, and reproduction. In addition to characteristics of the vegetative soul, the animal soul has powers of perception, locomotion, and one sense faculty. Humans have the power of reason and thought. Aristotle claims there are two types of virtue: intellectual virtue and moral virtue. Intellectual virtue are excellences of skill, science, wisdom, understanding, and intuition. We are both endowed with intellectual virtues at birth and can develop them with education. The moral virtues are not innate, but are acquired by practice, and can be lost without habitual practice. The moral virtues are a state of character and can be measured in degrees of worthiness. Virtues are the purposive choice between the excess and deficiency of a characteristic. Happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Virtue, then, is a state of deliberative moral purpose consisting in a mean that is relative to ourselves, that mean being determined by reason. If, then, this is universally true, the virtue or excellence of man will be such that a moral state as makes a man good and able to perform his proper function well. The virtues one considers can be those of conscientiousness, self-discipline, benevolence, and self-development. These virtues were thought to be the responsibility of individuals to employ in politics. The legitimacy of governance in Aristotle's Politics was based upon whether there was governance in the interests of the whole group. If rulers governed in the interests of themselves, governance was a perversion. The ideal polity was the aristocracy, claimed Aristotle, because they had the time to develop virtuous character.